bones that will form the skull. We discussed the cranial and facial bones. If you remember, a quick overview of the cranial and facial bones. First, cranial bones that we've seen. This was the frontal bone. And important structures that we've seen in the frontal bone were the glabella and the supraorbital foramen. Second bone that we've seen was the parietal bone. See the bone that is located in the back of the skull. This is a occipital bone. See many structures here related to the occipital bone. First, the structures that you see, it was this protruding eminence in the back of the head. This is my external occipital protuberance. We've seen the connection between the external occipital protuberance and this large hole. This large hole is the foramen magnum, and the foramen magnum is going to be connecting the brain to the spinal cord. The connection here between the external occipital protuberance and the foramen magnum is this ridge in the bone is what we call the external occipital crest. On both sides of the foramen magnum, we've got those elliptic shaped articular surfaces. That will allow the articulation of the skull to the first vertebra, the atlas. And remember the articulation between external, the occipital condyles and the atlas is what allows you to nod or to say yes with your head. We also have seen a foramen that is located deeper to the occipital condyles. You can see it from this view, a large irregular foramen. This is my jugular foramen. This is my jugular foramen on here. Another bone that we've seen last time was the temporal bone. And if you remember, we've seen three processes in the temporal bone. First, a process that connects it to the zygomatic bone here. The bone of the cheek is a zygomatic bone. We call this is my zygomatic process. We've seen a short and broad process that is going to be located behind your ears. This is the mastoid process. And one that is going to be thin, long, and pointed. This is the styloid process. We're looking on here, seeing a rounded tunnel. This hole that has a depth in it, this is the carotid canal, through which the carotid artery, internal carotid artery, is going to be passing to the inside of the cranial cavity to supply the brain with blood. I'm not sure, Theodore, about the question. Can you please take a screenshot of the question and send it to me? All right, so again, mastoid process, styloid process, and the zygomatic process. Those are the three processes here of the temporal bone. See the opening on here that will allow the sound waves to travel from the external ears to the middle and internal ears. This is my external auditory meatus. External acoustic or auditory meatus. This is the opening here in the temporal bone. Seen other cranial bones that we can see best from inside of the skull. First, we've seen this butterfly-shaped bone. This is my sphenoid bone. And remember, the sphenoid has two lesser wings, two greater wings, and this cavity. This is my sella turcica. So lesser wing, greater wing, and this is going to be my sella turcica. Remember, another cranial bone that I can see large part of it from inside of the cranial cavity. This was my ethmoid bone. And remember the ethmoid bone, you can see part of it here inside the cranial cavity, and the other part is located inside my nasal cavity. So part of it is, you can see it from inside the cranial cavity, the other part is inside, you can see it inside the nasal cavity on here. So important structures that we discussed as part of the ethmoid bone, if you remember, we have this elevated ridge. This is my Crista Galli, and this is the point of attachment of the brain to the skull. On both sides of the Crista Galli, we've got those cribriform plates. Those cribriform plates, those plates of bones that contain many holes, and through those holes you're going to be conducting the nerve fibers carrying the smell sensation up towards your olfactory bulb and olfactory nerves. We're looking on here. Another part that we can see of the ethmoid bone inside the nasal cavity. This is the perpendicular plate that forms the upper part of the nasal septum, the septum that splits the nasal cavity into right space and the left space. Also, you can see on here the superior and middle nasal conchae, those elevated parts on the lateral side of the nasal cavity. that will be slowing down the speed of the air that you're breathing, will warm it, will humidify it. This is my superior and middle nasal conchae here on the lateral aspect. So let me remove here the plate. So it all got removed. Seems that you can't remove the plate on its own. All right, so you see those ridges on here. Those are my superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha. The inferior nasal concha is a facial bone, a separate bone. It's not part of the ethmoid bone. The inferior nasal concha on here, the third one, this is a separate bone. It's not part of the ethmoid bone. So what are the 14 cranial bones that you've seen in here? Facial bones. We've seen first the mandible. Remember, the mandible did have on the outside surface this hole related to the chin. Those are my mental foramina, mental foramen, mental foramen. And if you remember, we have seen another foramen on the inside of the medial surface of the ramus of the mandible. On here, this is my mandibular foramen. Mandibular foramen. We've seen two processes here in the mandible. First one was the mandibular process and its articular surface. You see on here is that articulates with the temporal bone. This is my mandibular condyle. And anterior to it, you've got another process in here. This is my coronoid process. So you've got mandibular process with a mandibular condyle, and this is going to be the coronoid process. Moving on to the next facial bone, you got two maxillary bone or maxilli that will be forming the upper jaw. You got two nasal bones that will share in the formation of the nose along with the nasal cartilages. On the medial aspect of the orbit, if you see on here, I'm looking inside the orbital cavity. This bone on here, this triangular shaped bone, it's my lacrimal bone. So you've got two of them, one on each side, right and left. You've got inside the nasal cavity, two facial bones, the inferior nasal concha. You've got two of them here, inferior nasal concha. And the bones that will form the lower part of the nasal septum. This is my vomer bone. Vomer's bone. Another bones that we can see from this view on here. We're looking at the base of the skull. Let me move here. forming the posterior 1/3 of the hard palate, the bony part of the palate. We've got two palatine bones forming just the posterior 1/3 of the hard palate. The interior 2/3 of the hard palate are part of my maxillary bone. And those are the palatine processes of the maxillary bone. This is the palatine process of the maxillary bone. It's part of the maxilla on here. But one bone that we didn't discuss last class is this bone that is located in the anterior aspect of your throat. It serves as a site of attachment for the muscles of the tongue that will allow you to move your tongue. Also is going to be attached down to the larynx, the voice box that is formed of multiple cartilages. This bone on here is what we call the hyoid bone. Hyoid bone. It's the only bone in your body that doesn't articulate with another bone. So the only bone that does not articulate with another bone, it's only connected to muscles from all sides or ligaments from other and ligaments from other sides. This is going to be the hyoid bone. Important markings that we're looking at in here in the hyoid bone. Hyoid bone has two small horns because those are lesser horns, and two large horns, those are my greater horns. We also have discussed how can we identify the different vertebrae, if you remember. Remember, the first thing to look at in order for us to identify the vertebrae was the transverse process. What should I be looking at in the transverse process? I need to look whether or not I have a transverse foramen. If I do have a transverse foramen, like in here, I have a hole in the transverse process. So I have a transverse foramen, so I will go with this side. I need to check for a vertebral body. Do I have a vertebral body? Do I have one in here located? Zygomatic bones, yes, zygomatic bones are part of our facial bone. I just forgot to state them. All right, zygomatic bones are facial bones, yes. So do I see a vertebral body on here? No. So if you can't see a vertebral body, this tells you you are looking at C1 or atlas. Looking on here. Add this one on. All right, so what is the first thing I need to check? whether or not I have a transverse foramen. Do I have a hole in the transverse process? What do you see on here? Do you have a hole in the transverse process? In this vertebra, do I have a hole in the transverse process? Do you see a hole in the transverse process? Yes, I have a hole in the transverse process. I have a transverse foramen. So I'll go with this side. Next question is, do I have a vertebral body? Do I have this bulging bony part in front of the vertebral foramen? Do I have a vertebral body? Yes, I do. So if I have a vertebral body, what should I be looking at? Look for a process coming out from the vertebral body. Look at the dents. Look for a dents. Do I have a dents coming out from the vertebral body? Do I have a dents on here? Yes, I do. So this is going to be C2 or axis. All right, so we're looking here at this vertebra. The first things that I need to check is whether or not I have a transverse foramen. Do I have a transverse foramen on here? Yes, I have a transverse foramen, so this is going to be cervical. What is the next thing that you need to check is whether or not you have a vertebral body. Do I have a vertebral body on here? This bulging bony part in front of the vertebral foramen? Yes, I have a body. If you identify that you have a vertebral body, so what you're going to need to check next, whether or not you have a dents. Do I have a protruding bony process coming out from the body on here? Do I have something like this on this bone? No. So this is going to be anyone from C3 to C7. Anyone from C3 to C7 will have vertebral body but won't have a dents or an odontoid process. So looking at this one on here, what should I be looking first at? Whether or not I have a transverse foramen. Do I have a hole in the transverse process? Do you see any holes in the transverse process of this bone? Do I have a hole in the transverse process? No. You see, it's solid. It has no holes in it. What is the next things that I need to check? Many things that I need to check whether I have a body or not. All right, you don't look for a body. If you don't have a transverse foramen, what is the next thing that you need to check for? Spinous process. Look at how the spinous process looks like. Is it pointed downwards? Or is it blunt and horizontal? It's pointed downwards. So this means I am looking at which type of vertebrae? Thoracic, thoracic vertebra. All right, so let's have another one on here that we'll look at. All right, so what is the first thing I need to check in the vertebrae, whatever the vertebrae is whether I have a transverse foramen. Do I have a hole in the transverse process? Do I have a hole in the transverse process? Do you see any holes in here? No, so this is gonna be either thoracic or lumbar. What is the next thing that you need to check? If it's either thoracic or lumbar, check how the spinous process looks like. Is this pointing downwards, or is it blunt and traveling horizontally? What do you think? Blunt and horizontal. So this is going to be what type of vertebrae? It's going to be a lumbar vertebra. Lumbar vertebra. All right, we have seen also other parts of the spine. We've seen 5 fused vertebrae that are located at the lower end of the spine. This gonna be the sacrum. And 4 tiny fused vertebrae in the lower end of the spine. This is gonna be the coccyx. So again, the only important things that you need to remember is to be able to identify the sacrum and the coccyx. We don't need you to identify any structure on those 2 bones. All right, moving on to the last part of the axial skeleton is going to be the thoracic cage. Thoracic cage is going to be formed by a central bone called the sternum. And the sternum is going to be divided into 3 main parts. We have the manubrium of the sternum, manubrium sterni, or the manubrium of the sternum. We have the body of the sternum. And the lower end here of the sternum is going to be the xiphoid process of the sternum. So we've got manubrium, body, and xiphoid process. As you see, the ribs are articulating with the thoracic vertebrae posteriorly and are attached, for most of the ribs are attached to the sternum. If you notice on here, you've got ribs that are attached directly to the sternum, each one on its own. Each one has its own costal cartilage, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All of those are going to be attached directly to the sternum. No, xiphoid process is a tiny bone that is surrounded by cartilage as well. All right, so we're looking here at ribs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are attached directly to the sternum. That's why we call them true ribs. Each one has its own direct connection to the sternum. Call them my true ribs. Okay, to 8, 9, 10. You see on here, they are attached indirectly to the sternum. They are joining rib number 8 to be attached to the sternum. So they are actually attached to rib number 8 rather than attached directly to the sternum. All right, those are for ribs number 8, 9, and 10. If we're looking at ribs number 11 and 12, they are not attached at all to the sternum. So if the rib is indirectly attached to the sternum or it's not attached to the sternum, all those going to be considered false ribs. All rib number 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are false ribs. A subtype of false ribs that we're going to be considering here for 11 and 12, as they are not attached at all to the sternum, we call them floating ribs. So again, what we're looking at in here, if we look at the ribs, we see rib number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. All of them are attached. Each ribs number 7 is going to be they will be all attached directly to the sternum. For ribs number 8, 9, 10, they are indirectly attached to the sternum by joining rib number 7. For 11 and 12, they are not attached at all to the sternum. That's why we call them floating ribs. So again, 1 to 7, those are true ribs. From 8 to 12, those are false ribs. 11 and 12, we call them my floating ribs. So on the test, if I am marking here, for example, rib number 12, and you have two choices, one that says false ribs and the other one that says floating ribs. Which one would you pick as an answer? Which one would you pick as an answer? Floating. Try to be as specific as possible. So what if I didn't have floating in the choices? Is this question wrong? I didn't have floating as one of the choices, but I do have false ribs. So it's going to be false. It's not something wrong with the question. All right. So if you don't have floating ribs in the choices, simply is going to be, I wanted you to put false ribs instead. Does this make sense? All right. Moving on to the appendicular skeleton. Starting with the bones of the upper limb. First, we're looking at the pectoral girdle that would be forming the shoulder. Looking on here. First bone that shares in the pectoral girdle is going to be the clavicle or the collar bone. And second bone that shares in the formation here of the shoulder is going to be the scapula or the shoulder blade. So we've got two main bones on here that we're looking at. We've got the clavicle, we've got the scapula. If we're looking at the clavicle, clavicle has two ends. One bulging end on here that articulates with this part of the sternum. Can you remind me, what did we call this part of the sternum? What do we call this part of the sternum on here? The manubrium. Manubrium. So the clavicle on here, this is the bones that you can feel here. This is in the front, the scapula in the back, yes. And the clavicle is articulating with the central bone of your chest. This is called the scapula. I'm sorry, this is gonna be the sternum. Clavicle is articulating with what part of the sternum? It's my manubrium sterni or the manubrium of the sternum. So this end of the clavicle, is called either the sternal end. Sternal, why? Because it articulates with the sternum. And another name for it, it's gonna be the medial end. So either use sternal end or medial end. Why is it medial? Can you remind me what's medial and what's lateral? Medial means it's directed towards the midline. Towards the midline. It's going towards the midline. So if I'm describing this side of the bone, it's going to be medial. It's going towards the midline. Compared to this flattened end of the clavicle. This flattened end of the clavicle. It shares in the formation of the shoulder. If you hold your shoulder, you'll feel that it's formed of two bones. A process coming from behind, from the shoulder blade, and the continuation of the clavicle. Those are the two bones that will be forming your shoulder. So the process here, coming from the scapula, is sharing in the formation of the shoulder. So what do you call something related to the shoulder back from our very first chapter this semester? Acromial. So we're gonna call this process coming from the scapula. This process on here is my acromial process or acromion. And can you guess what do you think we're gonna name the end of the clavicle that will be sharing in the formation of the shoulder? What do you think we're gonna call the end of the clavicle that shares in the formation of the shoulder. If the end that was articulating with the sternum, we called it a sternal end. What do you think we're going to call the end of the clavicle that shares in the formation of the shoulder? It's going to be my acromial end. And is this going to be directed towards the midline? Is it closer to the midline, or is it located far away from the midline? Is it close to the midline or away from the midline? Clavicle, you see on here, this is my midline. This end of the clavicle is far from the midline compared to this end. So this end is medial end. The other name for it, this end here, the acromial end, is also called the lateral end. All right, so again, what are we looking at in here? We're looking at the collar. Distal means away from the point of origin. Distal means away from the point of origin. Lateral means away from the midline. All right, so again, what we should know here in for this bone, the clavicle, we need to know that the clavicle shares with the scapula to form your pectoral or shoulder girdle. The clavicle articulates with the manubrium of the sternum, and the end of the clavicle that articulates with the sternum is what we call the sternal end. Sternal end. Another name for this end, because it's directed towards the midline, it's the medial end. You see here the flattened part of the clavicle. It's directed away from the midline, not towards the midline. So it's going to be the lateral end. And at the same time, it shares in the formation of the shoulder along with the process coming from the clavicle. And remember, something related to the shoulder is called acromial. So we're going to call this end is my acromial end or lateral end. So how are we going to be checking out the question on here in the bone? The same exact way like what we did with the axial skeleton. Same exact way like what we did with the axial skeleton. Remember the axial skeleton, we did have three main types of questions, either to identify the bone, identify the bone marking, and another was to state the function or articulation of the bone. So what are all possible questions you can be asked in here, in this bone? So just to give you an impression about how questions can be addressed. So again, when you study, make sure you know the information, not relying that you can guess the answer from the choices. Make sure that you can actually state it, write it down without the need of having choices. So first possible question here is going to be our first question for the in-class activity for today. For number 1, Identify the bone for number 2. And 3. This marking is for 2 and 3. Question number 2. Identify the bone marking for number 3. What is the bone or structure articulating with 2? Number 4. What is the bone articulating with 2? So again, this is 1. This is number 2. And questions 3, 4 are addressing the same marking, which is number 2. Number 5 on here. Identifies the marking. 6, I'm asking what is the bone structure articulating with 5? 7, what is the bones that is articulating with 5? All right, so 7 questions on here, 7 questions, 3 markings. Questions 6 and 7 are addressing the same marking here, number 5. So I don't have to put number 3 and 4 on the diagram, or 5 and or 6 and 7. All right, because I'm asking about the same marking as 2 and 5. All right, so what do you think? What is this bone? Identify the bone. Clever. What is the bone marking? Number 2. Sternal end. Sternal end, or another name for it, it's medial end. What is the bone structure articulating with 2? What is the bone structure that articulates with 2? The manubrium of the sternum. What is the bone articulating with 2? What's the name of the whole bone? Sternum. You see the difference on here? What is the bone structure articulating with 2? You mentioned manubrium. You mentioned the specific part. And when I'm asking about the name of a bone, don't forget to mention the name of the whole bone. All right. Number 5, what is bone marking? What is this bone marking? Number 5. Acromial end. And what is the bone structure articulating with 5? A criminal end. All right. No, that's okay. It's a good way to remember it. A criminal end, but rather than I-O, all right? Acromial, close enough. All right, so what is the bone structure articulating with 5? What is the bone structure articulating with 5? Structure, you remember the spine here. What do we call the spine? It's my acromion. And what is the whole bone? What is the name of the whole bones that articulates with 5? Can you remind me, what do we call this whole bones that articulates with 5? The scapula. Right? Easy, easy. Those are all the possible questions that you can have for the clavicle. Those are all possible questions. Those are all the possible questions that you can have here addressing the clavicle. Right? You only have 2 markings, and those are all possible questions that you can have. Anything seems complicated? Anything seems complicated? All right, so we can have a break for 10. We come back, start our discussion of the scapula and the rest of the appendicular bones. Any questions before we go for a break? Yes, you need to pay attention to the question. You need to read the question and answer exactly what is the question is asking about. All right. Number 6 on here, what is the bone structure articulating with 5? And 5 was the acromial end. So it was the acromion. So you see on here, acromion is this bony process